Alrighty, so we sort of got into this. Qualitative methods is a bit different than quantitative in that we are we're more focused on a place and a space and people, specific types of people, either to do interviews or to be in the field and observe. And so there's a lot more data we collect that's descriptive, not necessarily quantitative. And that's why it's called qualitative methods. And we're not doing as much preparation in the pre observation phase. We're doing a lot more observing and writing and analyzing in the observation analysis phase. So as we've moved through the course, we've talked about theory, we've talked about conceptualization, operationalization, population sampling, and we still have these aspects in qualitative methods, but sometimes our observations are what help define the concepts that we're actually doing. So it's a bit of sort of like a reverse of the quantitative, and we'll get in that in a sec. But so field research, qualitative methods is a type of research method, and sort of different than quantitative methods are observations and our type of method are not super separate. Sometimes they are intertwined. So most observations are qualitative at the outset. We sort of start coding them and inserting them into quantitative space. And so qualitative, as we've talked about, is non-numerical, it's descriptive. A lot of categorical variables are qualitative, right? And so if you are ever reading a book and there's like a description of the setting and the people, like that's really what qualitative researchers do, is more writing narrative to get people who are reading it immersed in the space and understanding the space. And there's been a large amount of qualitative research in criminal justice, especially like in the 60s. There was like a big push on like cultures of poverty and people like from like people in their ivory towers and academics coming in and sort of like trying to observe and understand like how systems of poverty or oppression work. So a lot of labeling theory in criminology has come from qualitative methods, and also like subcultural theory, which identifies that there are certain cultures that are made around crime. So like gangs and like the urban underclass or whatnot. And these are all not my language, but the concepts that have been written about. And then there's, so there has been sort of this divide in criminology where there's like, and in every discipline of like what is more rigorous, quantitative or qualitative, and they're very different. They answer different questions. One is not better or worse than the other. It's just really like qualitative methods is better for if you're trying to explore a topic or if you're trying to understand a space and a place and a setting versus, and it's really good at building theory, whereas quantitative can be better at saying X causes Y. And we know this because we set up the design to make sure that there's no other bias in this space. And mixed methods is a really awesome way of doing research where you can combine elements of both quantitative and qualitative methods. So inductive versus deductive. Inductive is we have observations and then we develop propositions from them and then establish theory. Whereas deductive is we have a theory and then we create a hypothesis from that theory, and then we design an experiment and see whether or not that experiment is actually true, is true to our hypothesis. So deductive is a lot of quantitative methods, whereas inductive is very much the framework for qualitative methods. So as you see, one isn't better than the other, they're just different in how the theory flows from our observations or how our design is set up from our theory. Any questions thus far? Okay. So this is just sort of an overview of the types of methods that some of the types of methods we've gone through. And so if we can think about them within a spectrum. And so quantitative is often, like I said, greater control from the outset. We're setting up the design, we're ensuring who our participants are, we know and are keeping track of who our participants are and have like identification numbers for them. So when you imagine quantitative, there's a lot of like design at the forefront and control, and therefore there's a lot of internal validity. But a weakness of it is that it can be really artificial, right? Because the real world, like it allows us to sample and to make causal claims, but when we're setting up a social experiment, and a lot of times in criminal justice, we're dealing with social issues, it can feel a little artificial because it's not like experiments are a natural phenomenon in our social world. They're very much constructed in our eyes. So there can be issues with being able to state that like this actually is truth in the real world and can be applied in the real world versus we can make a causal statement. And so experiments are at the top of this because they are very controlled. We control our participants and the treatment, even the independent variable that we're giving is the treatment. So we're actually sort of like acting like people who are designating the treatment versus unobtrusive measures, which are more qualitative in nature, are we're observing and we are just like a fly on the wall. Like documentaries are a form of qualitative methods. So if you're thinking about types of documentary style, sometimes they're interviewing people, sometimes they are just observing an event and are present, and you're like sort of feeling like you're at the event because you're seeing the camera visually in the crowd, right? And so there's less control. The person who's observing is not able to say what the event is or establish who's going to be doing what. Instead, it's very much I'm just here like a fly on the wall, like I said. So there's less control, and therefore there's there's better external validity. So like we said with internal validity, yes, within the constraints of the experiment, it's completely valid. But if we apply it to the real world, it could fall apart. Whereas qualitative methods, since we're in the real world, so our external validity is strong. And it's natural. We're naturally observing what is going on. And so another example of qualitative methods would be like, that is more scientific, would be like Jane Goodall observing primates, right? She's not doing experiments on them. She's just observing how their interactions with each other reflects patterns and characteristics and is sort of developing theory from that. And so social surveys are going down in this spectrum because there is a lot of design aspects of it prior. Participant observations are also, in a sense, sort of in the middle because there are quantitative and qualitative aspects to it. Case studies, so if you're thinking about a particular incident of like a crime that occurred and you want to do a really highly intensive case study of that, that would be more qualitative, and you're not setting up the design or who the treatment is, you're just trying to explore. Histories are qualitative, so we go back and do historical analysis, and it's not like we could have changed history at all. So these are more qualitative spaces as well. Any questions about this spectrum?
No, Professor.
Okay. Alrighty. And so this is sort of a diagram of all the different types of qualitative methods. So there's Participatory action methods is when people who are being observed and being studied actually get a role in establishing what the research agenda is. And I might do a lecture on that next week as a supplementary thing. But the sort of bread and butter of qualitative methods is not that. It is field observations, content analysis, and interviews. So interviews we'll do a lecture on and get more intensive in it. But there's one-on-one interviews or focus groups, and focus groups can either be natural or artificial and being pre-designed or naturally set up, like if there are already groups within the field research that you're doing. Then there's one-on-one interviews, including structured and semi-structured interviews and unstructured, which we'll get into in another lecture. And then content analysis, like I said, is historical archives, any secondary data that we're working with that's not quantitative in nature is content analysis. And a really cool aspect of us being in the digital age is we can look at like online forums and like a whole digital communities and do research on that as well. And then field observations are sort of like the documentary setting type qualitative methods where the person is either working at the place that they're observing, like the examples I mentioned of Forrest Stewart, who like was hanging out in Skid Row and just building relationships with people who lived there who were houseless. And then Nicole Gonzalez Van Clev worked at a court place and wrote up her notes every day of like what happened throughout the day and wrote a book about it. And then there are also case studies. So like focus on a very particular incident and what occurred and how the people in relation to it view what occurred. So this is sort of a diagram of qualitative methods. And yeah, there's a lot of it. And it's sort of a different like setting than quantitative methods.
Professor, I had a question. Could you briefly go back to the diagram?
Yes.
What's ethnography? Is that how it's pronounced? Ethnography?
Ethnography, yes, you pronounce it perfectly. Ethnography is sort of like the documentary style qualitative methods where someone is actively in the space or setting and observing people. So there's more ethnography where someone's, like I said, with Gonzalez Van Clev, she worked in a court and so she observed that. Or there could be ethnography where someone is like in Becker's Outsiders. He was just hanging out in the subway and observing people and trying to be like a fly on the wall and not engage, but wrote up notes on it. And so ethnographies are synonymous with field research and that you're actively in particular places and settings and observing how those work. Did that answer your question? Okay.
Yes, I thought I was relating it more to like ethnicity or something like that. But
no,
that's clear.
You're not, it's not too far off because, okay, I'm not going to get super into this, but the history of ethnography comes from anthropology, and anthropology has large historical roots in colonialism of people from Europe observing non-European places and trying to understand culture. So you're not completely off, and that may be a good way to remember that. But yeah, in general, it's I'm trying to think of what the root word would be, like the Latin root word would be. Let me think about that. But yeah, I can see how you would make that connection.
Thank you, Professor.
So topics that are appropriate for qualitative methods, like I said in the beginning, qualitative methods and quantitative methods are not, one is not better than the other. They're good for different types of questions and topics. So we're The lectures after this are going to be set up. We're going to focus on qualitative interviewing and field research as two different parts of qualitative methods. So qualitative interviewing is a good way of gathering data in criminal justice studies, and it allows us to understand the subject's perspective. So if we're wanting to understand, like, how do people desist from crime? How do they stop committing crime? Then we might want to talk to people who have desisted from crime and say, you know, like, what made you feel like you were just had the space to not commit crimes anymore? And so we might talk to multiple people about that and reveal something that we would have never known based off of quantitative methods. So we can gather first-hand accounts of people's lived experiences and understand how people identify and their roles have influenced the outcomes of their life. And a lot of criminal justice qualitative interviewing is interviewing people who have committed crimes, for example, and also just trying to understand the impact of prison on people, how the toll it takes. So there's a large range of qualitative interviewing within criminal justice. For example, I'm currently doing qualitative interviewing with people who were released post-COVID and what their experience was like, if they were given the proper reentry services in order to be released, and how they've been adjusting post-COVID and how COVID has affected their own lives. And then there's field research, which is like ethnography. It's when people participate in the physical space that they're studying or try to be a fly on the wall in the physical space. So it really enhances validity because you can see things in the real world as they're actually structured, and there's no artificial nature to it. You're not designing it. It's not in a lab. It's in the real world, and you're observing it like social phenomenon. Usually, like we said, in sciences, it could be you observing interactions between primates or like other behavioral things. So it's primarily focused on interactions between people and their behaviors. So an example that the book provides is like street level drug dealers, how they distinguish their customers, how they interact with their customers. And as we said, ethnography focuses on the detailed and accurate description rather than explaining things. So oftentimes it's really nice to read ethnographies, like it's sort of a change of pace in reading articles that are quantitative because they will be descriptive. It'll feel like you're in the setting that you're reading about, and you'll get to know particular people who sort of feel like characters that you're like getting to know. But oftentimes we're still maintaining anonymity, so we'll use pseudonyms for the people we engage with to make sure that there's no pushback onto them. And so, as I mentioned, talking about our memo 4 assignment, reflexivity and positionality are really important in qualitative methods because unlike quantitative methods, we don't hide behind the design. We're not separating our identity from the space. Even if we're trying to be a fly on the wall and observe the space, us just being there might affect how people are in the space, right? Because they could think you're a cop, or they could think, oh, there's someone who's watching me, like I'm gonna do things a little bit differently. So we really need to think through how our identities show up in this space and how that might affect our observations. And also how our own perceptions may create personal biases. And there could be power dynamics that exist between observers and participants. So for example, if you're in the space because like you know the administrative person, like if you're observing a like group therapy space and you're in that space because the director introduced you, then there may be some power dynamics of people may try acting better or participate more because you're there and they think you're connected to the director or something like that. So there you need to be aware of and understand the power dynamics that exist, because they could be influencing your observations and what you're seeing. And if you find evidence that that's true, that people were acting differently, then you write that in your qualitative methods and talk about it. And that's an observation in itself, is how people interact with your own identity in the space. And that's a valid observation that should be talked about. And so, yeah, that's a great point. I will really need to work on being unobtrusive and allowing the conversation to flow from their point of view. In interviews, definitely. And also, yeah, a lot of how we structure interviews can influence how people respond to us, or even just how we're coming off. If we're having a bad day, people might feel that emotionally, because we're social, emotional beings. So there is this sense of a spectrum of objectivity and subjectivity, and this may be different based off of how much of an insider or an outsider we are in the space we're observing. I'm trying to make sure I covered all the points. Yeah, so difference between quantitative methods is, in qualitative methods, where our identity is shaping the field and the field is shaping us as well. And there are definitely emotional connections that are built in the field, and we need to recognize those limitations. And there are also advantages to having emotional connections, because we can get people to share more vulnerably about honestly what they perceive. When we're doing surveys, when we're doing experiments, we're setting up the space itself, but when we're doing ethnography and qualitative methods, the space is sort of setting up itself, and we're trying to figure out what's going on. Oh, there's a slide I wish was on here. Yeah, so connected to reflexivity and positionality is the level in which you are an insider and outsider in the space. So if you're an insider, then you might not be influencing the space as much, but because you're an insider, you might have particular perspectives about the space that you sort of need to unravel. So for example, in the Crook County book, Nicole Gonzalez Van Clev was initially on the public defender side of the court system. And so she had a very particular perspective just because of her positionality in the space. And then she also went to the prosecutorial side and worked in that side, which made her perceive public defenders in a completely different way, because her position changed within the space. So positionality and reflexivity are really important in qualitative methods.